Well, hello again, Greg, for the next version of our Air and Space Power Association podcast. It seems to be just manically busy over the last few weeks, and the big thing that caught our eye, I think, this last week was the announcement that the UK is buying F-35As, and a great deal of focus on the nuclear capability of these. This is what the Prime Minister had to say when he announced it.
I can announce that we'll procure at least 12 F-35A fast jets, and we will make these UK aircraft available to bear nuclear weapons if necessary. It marks the return of the RAF to nuclear deterrence for the first time in 3 decades, representing the biggest strengthening of our deterrence posture in a generation.
Now, Greg, the news has been really focused on this whole nuclear side of it. But of course, you and I, grey hairs, we've been around in the period of the Air Force's history when this was commonplace that we were operating nuclear weapons. In fact, you flew the Tornado with a nuclear capability. Just give us a sense of what that was all about.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's all incredibly familiar, but there you go. So I joined the Tornado Force as a boy, effectively. I think I arrived on the squadron at the age of 22, 23. And the very first role that we were taught and therefore stood on is the nuclear role. Now, we never actually flew with it because, thank goodness, war never got to that point. But we held a 15-minute readiness in our particular case with 2 nuclear weapons on each of the Tornadoes. There were 5 on the station I was at, so not an insignificant number of bombs. Ready to go at 15-minute readiness. It was.
Did you ever actually fly with them, though? I mean, did they ever leave the ground or?
No, we had what was known as dummy weapons that you could practice loading and do all the necessary bits and pieces. But these were live weapons, and it shouldn't be unsurprising to many that it's not the sort of thing you want to carry around just for a bit of training. So yeah, they were only there in case of the worst case scenario. If you go back in time to the Vulcan days, there was a little bit of flying with, I think, the blue steel weapon. But yeah, we very much kept these things locked up under lock and key, and really only emergency break glass type scenario.
And one of the things that they talk about being the aircraft, the F-35A being nuclear capable. I mean, bluntly, the bombs are about 600, 700 pounds in weight. They're not big when it comes to weapons. What makes a platform nuclear capable? What was it about the Tornado that meant that it could operate nuclear weapons where something like a Harrier could not?
Yeah, the bomb itself is actually not a big deal, believe it or not. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it drops in the aeroplane and it does its thing. So it's relatively independent in that sense. The important bit is the wiring and the mechanism to release that weapon. And it has to be, obviously, something that doesn't happen by accident. So it requires special wiring, special control panel, probably, especially in the newer aircraft. So you are literally there with completely separate safety brakes. So, for example, if software went crazy in an F-35, it's not going to accidentally release the weapon. You have mechanical interlocks and special wiring, all of which is very carefully controlled, very carefully managed. So there is, if you are dropping it, it's a deliberate act. And unfortunately, that does cost additional money, and it does need to be type certified. And interestingly, on the F-35, only the A model has that clearance. The B and the C models do not.
And it was called, what was it, WE-177, I think, wasn't it, the weapon at the time? There was a lot of talk, as there is now, about where these weapons were stored, because obviously that can be quite sensitive as well. Was that something that you knew where they were stored? Were they stored on the same basis, or was that part of the whole security and sensitivity around this capability?
Yeah, I mean, it was kept out of prying eyes for obvious reasons, but you knew when you were getting close to it because the barbed wire started getting rather thick and there were plenty of people there with machine guns and dogs. So we kept it under lock and key. It was well protected. The bombs themselves were in hardened shelters. An awful lot of hard work. The station that I was on, we had literally hundreds of RAF policemen working shifts whose primary role was to guard those weapons, whether they be in the storage or whether they be on the aircraft. And as I said, we had 10 of the weapons live armed and loaded on 5 aircraft. So it was quite an enterprise. But yeah, there was, I know we might talk later in the podcast about the incident at Bryce Norton, but yeah, we absolutely took security for these weapons as seriously as you possibly could.
The other thing that I found a bit weird is both you and I have spent a lifetime in the military, but we have had to deliver bombs on operations. And there was quite a big sort of responsibility on your shoulders when you did that, but you were doing it. It's what your training kicked in. How did the crews manage the psychological aspect of potentially having to go and deliver something as powerful as a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I look back on it now, and maybe even the enormity of it hasn't even sunk in today. You're sort of brought up to I mean, we knew the Warsaw Pact was there. It was a clear and present threat, and therefore we grew up with that as youngsters. And so for us to be sort of in confrontation wasn't unusual. I think that's the challenge today, is getting ourselves back into that mindset of a genuine existential threat. And so you had the mindset that, you know, in order to deter the other side, this was a necessary course of action. And you accepted what that meant. You know, when you signed the dotted line to join, it either meant you'd one day pay with your life on a conventional mission, or, if it ever happened, a nuclear mission. I don't think any of us ever really thought about the practical implications of having then dropped that weapon, because the situation the world would have got to for that to happen, I mean, clearly everything had gone to complete pot. So, the more you focus this on a deterrent, and the importance of it being there to stop things getting worse, the less you start to focus on the practicalities of what happens. Because I'm pretty certain after I dropped that weapon that 30 seconds later, I was going to be dust. It's not what it told you, but the idea that you were going to survive releasing a gravity bomb, and even if there was anything to survive for, quite frankly, quite sobering.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting conversation though, because I think we lived through some of this where it was part of our conversation, you know, one-way missions and the like. But I absolutely subscribe to the view that the whole idea of nuclear deterrence, nuclear bombs are an abhorrence. I think everybody thinks they're an abhorrence, but the day you actually have to use them, frankly, it's an awful day for mankind, the world, and the lot. So It is all about deterrence. You know, since the Second World War, these weapons haven't been used in anger. They have deterred because they are so awesomely powerful. And I think one of the things that seems to have happened is that we as a nation have our CASD, our continuous at-sea deterrent, the minimum credible independent nuclear capability, largely because we hope we never have to use it. But it does mean that you put a doubt into any potential adversary's mind. And what it appears to be that tactical nuclear weapons, whilst I must admit, philosophically, I can't quite get my head around what a tactical nuclear weapon is. I know what technically it is, but it either is a nuclear weapon or it's not. But the very fact that it looks like we're making a move to that creates more doubt in the minds of the adversary. But why do you think now? I mean, was it 1998, I think, that we took these weapons out of the inventory? So 27 years ago now. Yeah. Why now, do you think, is the time to bring them back in?
Well, we took them out then, of course, because the Cold War was ended and peace was breaking out and there was no existential threat to the UK or NATO. That has changed. So nuclear deterrence is all about signalling and will and intent. Now, today, we have that submarine at sea somewhere. Nobody knows where. Well, only a few people know where. But that's it. And that's there 24/7, 365 days. So there's no additional signalling. It's already there, ready to roll. But we know that those strategic nuclear weapons are the sorts of weapons that you employ against large population areas, i.e. it's the ultimate deterrent. And I think, you know, one of the policies you have is, do you fire one from that submarine or do you fire them all because you've given away the location of the submarine? So it's kind of an all or nothing solution. So the idea behind tactical air nuclear weapons, or ground launch for that matter, is it gives you the ability to move through a sequence of rungs on the escalation ladder that allow you to signal at different times. And of course, we've seen Russia do that. We've seen them do it in Ukraine. They've threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and it has somewhat worked. It's put NATO on the back foot. It's meant we've slowed up deliveries. We've been more cautious. So if you have something to signal back, of course, the danger with that is you then both start escalating. But in order to have the means by which you can say, if you think you can get away with a limited strike, you can't, because you'll get a limited strike straight back. So it's dragging that deterrent effect back as far as it can, you know, almost to just above the sort of top level conventional area. And if you read the SDR, it was that this has come from. And it talked about this gap between the top end of conventional and then the Hail Mary of your strategic nuclear deterrence. And it's trying to fill some of that gap. The Americans have it, the French have it, and other European nations have it through loan from the Americans. I think the French even have a word for it, obviously in French, but it's deliberately used as a signaling act. It's look, guys, we are ready. This is what we can do. Here's one to show you that we're up for this. And nobody wants to get to that stage. Of course they don't. Which is why everyone getting focused on the means of delivery and what actually happens afterwards. I mean, quite frankly, it's already gone wrong if it gets to that stage. But this is about bringing that threshold down to the point that stops Russia thinking it can grab a bit here or grab a bit there.
It's also, I think, a really good example of that, what you're talking about there is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because there we DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2, DEFCON 3, DEFCON 4, DEFCON, and they were very specific. I'll pull a graphic up to cover it, but very specific ideas around, right, the weapons are now being matched to the bombs. These are now being loaded into aircraft. The aircraft are now airborne. It allowed you to create that sort of sense of escalation, and therefore, now, that in itself can be a worry, but that at least forces both sides to at least have a conversation. Is this really what you want to do? Whereas if you're only dealing with a strategic nuclear deterrent that's already available 24/7, you can't ratchet that threat up. Well, you can ratchet around the tactical missiles at all. The one question that pops up around that was that our national strategy, minimum credible, independent, this won't be independent, will it? Because we don't have our own tactical nuclear weapon. So we'll be joining the sort of NATO club of nuclear weapons, the B-61, I think it's called, bomb that the Americans provide. And therefore, it's a dual key capability, isn't it? Now, do you think that is a massive limitation? Or quite frankly, given its ultimate purpose is deterrent, the fact that behind closed doors, the American president may be turning around and saying, I'm not going to let you use this, but I am going to pretend that you can go right up to the point of using it so it loses deterrent. How do you think that's going to work in practice?
Yeah, on a simple practical level, it's an extra level of bureaucracy. Because if it's an American weapon, wherever it may store, and it doesn't have to be stored on the base with your aircraft, it could be stored in a base down the road. And moved up there at a time of escalation. And I think that's another important factor, Sean, is that when you want to signal to Russia that, hey, you are pushing us too far here, that the sudden movement of nuclear weapons and aircraft being put into shelters, an activity that they will see on satellite imagery that is beginning to show us ratcheting up our preparedness, that alone can be a signal. So the idea that these aircraft have to be loaded 24/7 actually isn't the case. This is very much an emergency break glass. In the actual sort of question that you're asking, therefore, it would require Americans to be there, probably guarding. It's their property. They don't want us just making our own minds up. And there will have to be a formal sort of handshake process where they're handed over once that clearance activity goes through its sort of checks and balances. But even when I was doing it back as a boy in the 80s and 90s, it was part of the NATO umbrella. And there was a NATO process that took place that made the decision for NATO to go nuclear. And once NATO makes that decision, then the bureaucracy of handing the weapons over and going through the checks and balances is a relative formality. The real question here is, will NATO ever go nuclear? And to what extent might America hold that back or not assist it? Which is an entirely fair question, particularly in the current context. But the idea that the Brits are going to go dropping nukes around Eastern Europe independently, I'll be honest with you, is just fanciful. I'm really struggling to think of the scenario that would ever require that, because the rest of NATO might be quite unhappy if we start doing that independently. So the idea that this is not a sovereign capability, I think everyone needs to just ratchet that down a little. This is very much about the NATO nuclear deterrent. The SDR made that crystal clear. The idea that we just have to go through some extra checks and there's some extra flags outside the storage facility, yeah, that is the price you pay. But that is a very small price to pay compared to the one of building and inventing your own aircraft, your own weapon, and going through the very, very long and expensive clearance process. Just look at the Vanguard replacement to look at that.
Yeah, I spoke with one of our sort of former nuclear MOD specialists, and he said the cost of developing our own weapon, tactical nuclear weapon, would be absolutely obscene. And given the
Yeah.
fact that there's no plan to ever use it, surely we can, for a fraction of that cost, be part of a team approach. But at least we've now got a platform that can do that, and therefore it creates some flexibility, and therefore just changes the calculus for your enemy. That suddenly there's another thing that they've got to think about.
Yeah, I mean, there is some criticism over the nature of the weapon. I mean, the weapon is a pretty dumb weapon in many respects. It's a gravity bomb. It's not a standoff weapon. But the Americans are inventing or building right now a standoff replacement. The French already have one. So in theory, in time, if the Americans clear their latest weapon on the F-35A, then in theory, that the nuclear sharing can just switch over to a new weapon. So yeah, yes, it means we're very dependent. Of course it does. But the idea that we can't be dependent on America for quite a lot of things, including tankers, which we might want to discuss, then that's the way it's going to be. But that's the nature of collective defence in NATO.
So so this was all linked to the F-35A and the story about the nuclear side. But if you look at it from an air power perspective, I remember one of the briefings that we both sat through. It was focused on, air power capability rather than nuclear. And I do think I mean, let's face it, I was the requirements manager for the F-35 program back in the day. So I had to do the Men in Black, look at lights, flash, forget everything. But, it's a family of aircraft, A, B, and C. Bravo, the vertical takeoff and landing, was a design driver for the family, and it was what the UK asked for. But of course, the A has popped out as being about 2/3 of the cost. It goes significantly further. I think the B is about 450 miles radius of action. 770 is what's advertised for the A. And of course, because it's by far and away, I think there's nearly 1,200 aircraft now being delivered. Vast majority of those are A's. Therefore, there's a lot more experience gained in the whole supply chain and everything, and how. So if you're going to recognise there was a gap in the Royal Air Forces, in the UK's combat air capability, A's are evidently the answer. And yet this whole conversation seems to have been completely shrouded by the nuclear debate.
Yeah, yes, you're right. I think the nuclear piece actually is almost like an incidental added extra that you get for free. Not quite free, but if you're sharing a weapon that already exists, and goodness knows what the Americans charge you on rent for a nuclear weapon, but who knows? The infrastructure, yeah, a little bit of spend. The training is almost minimal. It's the sort of thing you do in the sim once every 6 months or once every 12 months. It's a relatively straightforward mission. It's horrendous, but in terms of the tactical nous required, it's relatively straightforward. So the nuclear role is a relatively easy add-on. You're right. The real question here is, why do we need more aeroplanes anyway? And what does that mean to carry a strike? Because clearly that it has connotations, and people have got quite fixated on that. It made very clear in the SDR that the Air Force needed more F-35s, and it then went on to say could be A's, could be B's, and 3 weeks later they came up with an answer. But it is about Typhoons slowly but surely going out of service over time, GCAP coming in at some point in the next, let's say, decade. And these are there to fill the gaps, because the UK air defence is primarily done by Typhoons. And what are you going to backfill that with? And as we know, quite a few of those Typhoons right now are deployed around the world. So how do you continue to protect the UK and stay safe at home? So these A's are really part of that problem, i.e. let's fill the capability gap that we've got conventionally. The nuclear is just an extra bit. And in fact, in many ways, this has been given a hard time, but actually it's a bit of political genius, because it is actually going to probably be cost neutral, plus or minus a few quid in the end, in pure terms, because the airplanes are cheaper and that will be the money you use for the infrastructure. The only sort of knock-on effect, and a lot of naval commentators have picked up on it, is, well, this takes away B's from the front line. Well, actually, it doesn't do that either. By putting A's on the conversion unit and freeing up the B's that sit there today, you actually end up about numbers neutral with the front line numbers of B models for the first 74 buys we're going to do. So I am pretty pro this. I think you get quite a lot here for almost zero outlay. Unfortunately, we're still talking 5 years, so it's still some way off.
No, I don't know. It's a sensitive subject, but having spent a lot of my military career operating off carriers, and I was a huge fan of the capability. I mean, the ability to operate Harriers, a little bit of national sovereignty floating around the world. I get it. I absolutely get it. But it seems to me we've had this conversation before. If you're going to do carriers, you need to do them properly. And it isn't just about the carrier. It's about a whole host of capabilities around it. And our main focus for that from an M&D perspective will be China, Indo-Pacific, stuff like that. America's turned around and said, we'll worry about that. You worry about Europe. And all of a sudden, you're back into this debate about the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force have always been talking about we have to have Bs because otherwise they can at least then operate off the carrier. If you operate As, they can't operate off the carrier. And I do think for some time we live with this compromise where the air power capability, Bs are not as effective as As. They don't go anything like as far. And I remember being part of an unclassified, but a look and saying, if you can only go 450 miles, you can do this. If you can go 770 miles, you can go this, or you can endure in the target area for 3 or 4 times as long. Therefore, from a purely combat air perspective, the As are a hell of a lot more bang for buck. And I do wonder whether history may judge that we've compromised some of our capability in order to put aircraft on the carrier, when I do wonder whether the carrier will feature as prominently in the next generation of our nation's capability as it did for the last decade or so.
Yeah, I think even the most staunch naval commentator or carrier supporter will say we bought the wrong aircraft. They would have far preferred the C model with cats and traps to give them the most bang for the buck they could have got. And in many ways, that probably would have been the better answer. The problem was it was unaffordable. And that's why we didn't go down that route. I'm going to make a prediction here, Sean. So by the end of this next buy, I think we're buying 20, I'm going to get my maths right now, 27 more F-35s in the next tranche. 12 will be F-35As, 15 will be Bs. That will make a total F-35 force of 74, minus we've lost one at sea, so it would have been 75. So that's 74. But of that 74, 62 are B models. Now, the requirement right now in defence is to maximum put 24 B models on one carrier at any one time. Now, I know the Navy would like to do more than that, but that is the funded requirement. Now, getting 24 from 62 is not difficult. Getting 24 from 62 all the way up to 2069 will be difficult, and therefore there's a question about whether we need to buy more downstream. I make a prediction here, we won't buy any more Bs. Partly because of the limitations of the aircraft, but mostly because the new hybrid air wings that the SDR talks about is how you fill that gap, not with more manned Bs, but with more hybrid combat, collaborative combat aircraft. So I know that's a bit of breaking news and it's only my prediction, but I think these next 17 Bs will be the last we ever buy.
Yeah, I wonder whether we even go ahead with the 17 Bs, but
15. Sorry, it's 15. I get my numbers right.
15, yeah, just because of you've had the excuse of an SDR. Regardless of what we decided before, where's our focus today? If our focus is the UK, the Northern Gap, Europe, anti-submarine warfare, I'm not sure if you were doing that with a blank sheet of paper whether the carriers would appear high up that list at all, and therefore how much of your money do you invest in that rather than anti-submarine warfare and some of the other capabilities that clearly are required at sea. And I don't know, I mean, I know the danger is we go delving into an inter-service rivalry. I don't think that is helpful at the moment, but I do think it's just this announcement has definitely turned the dial slightly, because it's putting the conversation more about what air power capability is about and less about where you land and take off.
Yeah, and I think there's a massive input here of the NATO first direction of travel, and you hear naval commentators. Yeah, it's not just NATO, and NATO is worldwide, and of course we should be in the Indo-Pacific. I get it because that justifies a bit more the bigger carrier with the bigger air wing. It's there right now. It's just sailed from Singapore yesterday with 17 aeroplanes on it at the moment, I think. In a NATO first scenario, it is really hard to see where you would put a QEC class carrier with 24 F-35s on, because it's not going to reach any strike targets, not unless it gets in very, very dangerous waters, which is going to make it vulnerable. It's going to be doing a lot of ASW, anti-submarine warfare, in the sort of Greenland-Iceland gap. And that's not what F-35s do. Yes, you can use them to defend the task group, but you don't need 24 for doing that. And why would the UK send its most precious strike asset, out of harm's way?
So very quick, a quick one as well. Just the A's. Just correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't think they had a retractable probe. So aren't they going to be purely the American refueling system? And therefore, how are we going to operate that with UK assets?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. The newspapers, when they rang me, I'm sure they were ringing you too, were more focused on that. Because I think for some people, they think that's the reason not to do this. And I can kind of understand why they've said it. So in America, the USAF, the American Air Force, fly with what's known as the boom method. In other words, a big metal probe comes out and sticks into a hole in your aeroplane and refuels you. The Marine Corps and the US Navy use our method, which is the probe and drogue. The F-35A is a USAF aircraft, therefore it has the boom. We in the UK, our Voyagers don't have a boom equipped. They just have the probe and drogue system. And that is a problem for the F-35A. It's a problem for the P-8, the E-7, the C-17, and the RJ-135. So for a long time, we've been bringing aircraft into service that are incompatible with our current tankers. I think we're going to fix that. I think we'll see some boom tankers downrange. You and I now know, because we heard it said the other day, that GCAP is likely to bring a boom requirement. And my understanding is that's largely going to be driven by the Japanese, who tend to use the boom method, and therefore they want to stick with their methodology, and that's what their tankers have. So there's a high likelihood here that the Royal Air Force will have a boom tanker in time. In the interim, if these A's are sitting on the OCU at Marham, they won't need to go tank. In fact, they could probably do twice as long a mission as a B can without having to refuel. So that's that problem solved. And secondly, if they're going to do a nuclear role, heaven forbid, because it's going to be such an extreme event, then we'll use NATO tanker pool and we'll use American tankers. If they give us permission to use the bomb, they're probably not going to say, but you get your own gas and figure it out. They're going to help us. And they've got a lot of boom tankers. So yes, it's a factor, but it is not a showstopper.
So the other one about, you mentioned there a couple of times, was GCAP, this Global Combat Air Program, a collaborative venture with Japan and others that is looking at 2035 in service, 2040, taking on capability into the future. But obviously we don't have time to go into detail now, but there's going to be an interesting choice here, isn't there, about do you buy more F-35s or do you invest it in GCAP program? Now, traditionally, national programs end up being an order of magnitude more expensive, than and not necessarily better, but what they do provide is national capability. Do you think this F-35A announcement is going to have an impact on GCAP or not at all?
I don't think it's going to have an impact. I can see why it in theory gives GCAP a bit of breathing space. In other words, the pace of delivery of GCAP is not so critically tied to the withdrawal of the Typhoon, because if you like, the F-35AB is a stopgap interim fix. So I see it as an insurance policy rather than a danger to GCAP program. That said, I think the Japanese are driving the timeline on GCAP, and therefore there doesn't really need to be any delay. But just doing some maths in public again, I mean, currently the UK has about 100 Typhoons. We've just agreed in a minute, within 5 years, we're going to have 74 F-35s, A/Bs. As Typhoon begins to draw down over the coming decade or 15 years, we're going to see our numbers get down quite low again. So yeah, I would not be surprised if you saw a few more A's get bought after that first buy of 12 in order to just pad out the 2030s a little bit more before GCAP comes. And nobody knows how many GCAPs we're buying. Could be 5, could be 50.
But it is fascinating, isn't it? Because you and I joined a service where we had, Buccaneers, Jaguars, Harriers, Tornadoes, Phantoms, Lightning. I could go on. Very role-specific aircraft. But every different aircraft fleet you run costs you a fair chunk of change because it's spares, it's specialist help and whatever. And there's always been this sort of move to try and minimize the number of different types around. And is 2 the minimum type, or is it 1? Now, for those who are uninitiated, 2 sounds like a bit of a waste, but actually, if you ground the fleet because the wings suddenly show cracks or stuff like that, you can't have all your eggs in one basket. Therefore, having 2 combat air fleets seems to be the minimum credible with some degree of redundancy. Is that therefore the answer that we use F-35 but 2 different marks of F-35? Do we have to look at a different program? Is that the justification for GCAP?
Yeah, it's a policy we've had for a while now. I'm not sure it's actually written down, but if you remember the 2010 SDR, which was particularly painful, me a Tornado man and you a Harrier man, that was not a great time to be either of those types. But in the end, it came down to one type remaining alongside Typhoon. So that's why they went for one type rather than a bit of both. Because you're right, keeping three small fleets does increase cost. Now, a lot of people criticize this decision to go down the A route. Oh, well, that's 2 different fleets. Well, I would argue it's from the same supplier, Lockheed Martin. And I think that's the point here. If you go down a single source, if that source, for whatever reason, has a problem, or that particular engine has a failure that is systemic, or the software, goes doolally, having another supplier with another platform, in our case, Typhoon, means you don't suddenly lose everything. We've seen that with the Hawk. So when the Hawk T2 had an engine problem, we didn't have a plan B. Our military flying training system ground to a halt on the problems of one engine because of one engineering fault on that particular engine type. So yeah, going away from a single source solution, particularly for your combat air, is a sensible way to go. Unfortunately, in this day and age, I'm not sure we can afford that everywhere. But if you look around, helicopters, transport fleet, even our ISTAR fleet to a small degree, the only area where we're currently single source, it would be our tankers. But we could convert our A400s if we wanted to. So yeah, having 2 sources is a good thing.
Yeah, the tanker's an interesting example, though, isn't it? Because we base that on a commercial aircraft, so we have some sort of benefits from that. I'm also interested in the bang per buck argument because F-35, I think it's 80 odd million for the A model, but of course the price comes down gently as they produce more. But what we don't talk about much is the cost for flying hour. I did a quick bit of look. It's $42,000 a flying hour at the moment. That's considerably more than the F-16, considerably more than legacy platforms. And I think when we were in procurement, for every £1 you spent in procuring something, you spend £7 through life. And that's where the real chunks of change come out. And I do wonder, it's nice to have the luxury of having 2 different aircraft types. But GCAP, if you look back through, maybe it's something we look at one of the podcasts. You look back at Tornado, you look back at Typhoon, you look at some of the collaborative programs that we've done. They have produced some very good aircraft, but my goodness, have they been phenomenally expensive. And I'm not sure how well they'll stack up when we look at the bean counters, looking specifically at something that's a proven track record like the F-35.
Yeah, you're right. Everyone's guilty of looking at the window sticker price, of buying it out the shop. But actually, the running costs, the operating costs are so critical. In fact, end up dwarfing the initial outlay. But that's why flying hours are so precious, and it's why the simulator has become such a critical part of the training. Not only because it saves money, because it's obviously not costing half as much, even less than that. But it also, you can't do your secret squirrel flying in the air. You can be observed. So you do it in the simulator.
We're going to save that for another podcast because we get into a whole list of stuff. I've got loads of stuff on that.
We're doing a secret squirrel podcast.
Well, yeah, but I remember times when, in fact, I remember being in your office not long before I left the service, having a somewhat heated discussion about the live synthetic debate. So we'll get onto that.
I let you have coffee and keep your hat on, though, didn't I?
It wasn't quite that, but it felt like that as I walked out. No, but the last thing I want to look at is this whole prize thing. I'm looking at the news a couple of days ago, when we're filming here, that the Ukrainian special forces, there's been another attack on Russian bomber fleet, Su-35s. I think they reckon they've taken out another couple of these. It follows on from their attack of an air basing where they took out a whole load of bombers with some drone attacks. Really ingenuity. Why it relates back, though, we've seen in this last week or so, protesters break on to Bryce Norton. And whilst a lot of the news was talking about just being vandalism, painting the sides of an aircraft, if you look at First of all, they managed to get access to some of the limited operational fleet of our aircraft. These tankers, they may not be dropping bombs, but we've only got 14 of them, I think, and they're used for the Falklands, QRA North, QRA South, and the eastern flank of NATO. They are critical. Therefore, I would suggest this is sabotage, not vandalism. But I was really interested, first of all, that the news seemed to pile onto the station commander, which I thought was outrageous, absolutely outrageous. This is a Royal Air Force. This is a UK defence. This is a political issue that we have failed to match our defensive posture to the threat out there. And that's true of a whole raft of things across defence, that we are now so vulnerable that luckily it was only a couple of protesters on little electric bikes zipping in and squirting some paint in. But if that was something that the Ukrainians are doing to Russia regularly, that the Israelis were doing to Iran, it just shows how easy it would be to take out some of the cutting-edge military air power capability today. I appreciate that the defence of our military estate, we can't use Brize Norton necessarily as the model, because obviously it's a joint civilian military airfield there. But it is a grave worry, isn't it? Isn't it indicative of the challenges we face to this SDR and getting ourselves configured for the current threat environment?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is you're absolutely right. I mean, the pile-on of Lou Henton was just disgraceful, particularly by certain sitting MPs, which is just not on. They know that they can't answer back. They didn't know the facts. I guarantee you, this will be about decades of underfunding and under-resourcing. We've put all our eggs in one basket. We've not had the manpower that we used to have to guard, to do all the different processes. Much of that is handed out now to contractors or to other agencies. Yes, there is technology available, but even that costs money. So look, we'll have to wait and see what the findings are. But yeah, the blame on one particular individual, when we knew that there was something more behind that. There are people out there who want to score points for completely different political reasons. But put that to one side. There are two aspects to this. One is we knew that our airfields are more vulnerable. We've known that for a long, long time. In the Royal Air Force has been doing what is called agile combat employment, which is the idea that you disperse, put your aircraft in hardened places, conceal them. You need to put protective forces around there. Most of our stations now have a regiment field squadron resident on the unit. So in a wartime scenario, we really need to up our game. I think what this has demonstrated is we weren't expecting to be at war with our population. And clearly there are some people who think it is clever to do this type of damage to their own nation, to score their own political aims. And if that's the way that certain people in this country are going to act, and we'll see how they go through the courts, then we need to rethink how we protect our bases in peacetime. And if that is very large walls with a lot of people with, whatever, then okay. If that's where they want to take us, I mean, it's a pretty sad indictment. What's even worse is that these particular individuals think that they're doing something to help Gaza. And I think all of us, despair at the plight of the Gazans and Palestine. The idea that pouring paint down a Voyager has made any difference whatsoever is just fanciful, and has completely misunderstood the role of the Royal Air Force in that part of the world. But look, people protest. Unfortunately, these days they protest quite violently. And therefore, we're going to have to think, how we now guard our stations 24/7.
I think for me, there was a delicious irony looking at Glastonbury. If you looked at the perimeter fence for Glastonbury, that was more robust in terms of a physical barrier than is available on most of our military bases.
Yeah, well, that's different, of course, because they're trying to save the £500 entrance ticket fee. So that's a purely commercial decision. You're right. The contrast is stark, but they only have to do it for 3 days, not 365. So there's another thing.
I agree. The one thing I would say is slightly different, though. I do think we've configured our military over the last 35 years to be at sort of rest, sort of 70 or 80% readiness, because we know that our ministers will see a hotspot arriving somewhere in the world. We'll get warmed up to go and do deployment, expeditionary operations, and then we'll, in a matter of days or weeks, we'll go off and be ready to go. you and I both were grown up in the Cold War, where we were ready every day. We expected this trigger to happen every day. We didn't expect to have any warning at all. And therefore we had tac valves, op valves, people were live armed. Nobody would dare break onto a base because they'd be shot, because we'd have assumed this is a start of hostilities. Whereas at the moment, we seem to philosophically be not expecting something to happen. And I think that's a grave worry. And I think that is a grave weakness, not only highlighted by Bryce Norton, but actually philosophically for our military, we are not at a readiness. You and I, when we were doing tac valves, 2 hours readiness, you had to have your bags fully packed in, ready to deploy, to take your jets away or whatever. None of that happens.
I'd go a step further. I mean, it is a worry, but actually it's a mindset change back to that era. Because you and I didn't just worry about, the Soviet, Warsaw Pact threat. We also had a domestic terrorism threat actively targeting, people in uniform. So when we left home, we didn't wear a uniform. When we got in our car, we looked underneath to see if there was a bomb under there. We had our cars checked when we arrived on base. We worried about the terrorist threat, and that effectively meant we were constantly, on our toes and observing what was happening around us, whether we were in the pub downtown or at work. And I'm afraid we are heading back to that world, because it's either going to be activists doing their thing, or it's going to be little grey men, dragging up undersea cables and setting fire to, power stations and the like. And we are vulnerable to that. And therefore, we need to have a complete rethink. But I think before everyone starts thinking this is an Air Force problem, that could have been any base. It could have been any military base. And I'll tell you what, it could have been any critical national infrastructure. So this is a countrywide issue. And I think when we talk about this 5% spend for security, 3.5% for defence, what that 1.5% is going to be spent on, I think will be very interesting, because you could lie and cheat. I understand that the Italians are going to count the bridge between Sicily and Italy as part of their 1.5 security spend, because it's reinforcement capability. But we should be spending it on better fence lines, better security, better systems in place that can keep an eye on things. So I think we are now at a point of change, and Bryce is finally that wake up call that perhaps we've just been ignoring for too long.